Final Fantasy is easily one of the most popular and profitable gaming brands out there, and it has so many games under its belt. However, many fans fail to notice that Final Fantasy actually has many spin-off titles that don't bear the Final Fantasy name. So stay tuned to today's video as we discuss 9 games that you didn't realize were Final Fantasy spin-off games. Number 9. Vagrant Story. Vagrant Story was a game that marked Square Enix's leap into the polygonal 3D world. It incorporated a very distinct art style and accommodated the system it launched on with a low polygon count. This meant that the game was pretty low spec, but was top-notch for the system at the time of release. The game takes place in Valendia, which takes up the northern part of a region known as Ivalice, a world that recurs throughout the Final Fantasy series. Yasumi Matsuno's team had to incorporate a mixture of gameplay styles, from turn-based battles to platforming. This delivered an overall experience that stood out from Square Enix's previous titles. The Western release of the game deviated from the straightforward and original dialogue in favor of a more flowery Old English type of dialect. Number 8. Crystal Defenders. Crystal Defenders is another title that is set within the world of Ivalice from the Final Fantasy series. The game served as a location for several titles within Final Fantasy, such as the Tactics series and 12. Crystal Defenders is a series that fits within the traditional JRPG format, as well as mixes its own mark with a tower defense type system. In addition to all of this, Crystal Defenders actually marked Square Enix's first foray into the mobile market. The entire game was designed with a touch screen in mind and allows the player to place down their characters and navigate through levels with ease. The game was pretty successful, but received poor reviews for its control scheme and the AI used within the game. The sequel, Vanguard Storm, actually addresses the vast majority of the game's flaws and was much more well received. Sadly, both of the games were delisted from every digital store in 2017. Number 7. Airgees. Saiichi Ishii created Dream Factory, a Japanese-based studio that created some of the original fighting games such as Virtua Fighter and Tekken. While Virtua Fighter might not be anywhere near as popular as it used to be, Tekken is easily one of, if not the biggest fighting games right now. The studio collaborated with Square Enix on multiple projects, such as The Bouncer, To Ball Number 1, and Airgees. Airgees started off as an arcade fighter with original characters and even some fighters from the Final Fantasy series. The game was set around a fighting tournament, with the winner deciding who would wield a sword. In addition to it having the main game with quests, players could also involve themselves in dungeon crawling. The two characters who crossed over from the Final Fantasy series were Cloud Strife and Tifa Lockhart. Number 6. Stranger of Paradise. Stranger of Paradise is a game that feels more like a prequel or even a reimagining of the Final Fantasy series, as well as crying for help from its creators Tetsuya Nomura and Kazushige Nojima. From the trailers released so far, Jack is a thoroughly unlikable character who is constantly going on about how he wants to kill Chaos. In every scene within the trailer, he was going on about the chaos, which sprouted multiple internet memes about this crazed character and his desire to end the chaos. The character feels very one-dimensional and a parody of the normal and traditional Final Fantasy character. When the game was released, it became the 4th worst-selling game within the Final Fantasy series and is a laughable title for the company and its many investors. Square Enix was heavily disappointed with this game and refused to market it after its release. Number 5. Chocobo Racing Titles. Players unfamiliar with Final Fantasy's reoccurring feathered friends may mistake the Chocobo spin-off titles as original efforts unaffiliated with any pre-existing property. Case in point, the Final Fantasy name is nary to be seen on the box of PlayStation games such as Chocobo Racing and Dungeon respectively. Critics saw the former as an attempt on Square's part to capitalize on the success of Nintendo's Mario Kart series. While the first Chocobo Dungeon title didn't make it stateside, its sequel did, and even retained the 2 in its title for its Western release. Chocobo GP for the Nintendo Switch was panned by players for its monetization model. Number 4. Mystic Quest. JRPGs are super popular in Japan, but they've actually found it out into Western markets. Mystic Quest was an attempt to make a Japanese RPG a much better experience for English-speaking consumers. Rather than just porting over the Japanese release of the game, they wanted to curate a game that was perfect for English viewers. This game was dubbed Baby's First JRPG by fans. The game incorporated more elements of puzzles and action with tools such as grappling hooks and axes. Western critics at the time went out to pan the game for its oversimplification of the JRPG format. In later years, the game has also been praised for having one of the best soundtracks in the Final Fantasy series. Number 3. Dirge of Cerberus. Dirge of Cerberus was one of the many spin-off titles centered around the cast of Final Fantasy VII. This entry was a third-person shooter that allowed players to don the cape of broody misery guts Vincent Valentine. It's been speculated that the game's creation was heavily inspired by the success of mature action titles on the market, such as Capcom's Devil May Cry. Unfortunately, Square's efforts don't match that game's quality with its repetitive enemies, awkward gunplay, and considerably smaller arsenal. Fans of 7 might enjoy its lavishly detailed cutscenes, but that's about it. Number 2. Super Mario Hoops on the Nintendo DS. The Super Mario titles have often moved into the sports category when Nintendo outsources their franchise for very specific releases. Many of these titles go from tennis to golf, or even basketball in one case. During the DS era of games, Nintendo outsourced the Super Mario Bros. Franchise to create Super Mario Bros. Hoops on the DS. The game was your very traditional basketball game on the system, but also featured an unusual amount of characters from the Mushroom Kingdom and even some all-stars from the Final Fantasy series. Many Mario characters were omitted from the original list, but we did get many of the fan favorites such as Waluigi and Diddy Kong. Some of the Final Fantasy characters include the Cactus and even Moogle from the games. The Square Enix characters were very strong within the game and are actually the best characters for playing nowadays. They definitely wanted to show respect to Square Enix by making their characters the best within Mario Hoops on the DS. Number 1. The Mana series. The Mana series is an action RPG franchise that eschews the turn-based structure of its forefathers in favor of real-time combat. Original title, Seiken Densetsu, was released on the Game Boy in America as Final Fantasy Adventure and Mystic Quest in Europe. Its Super Nintendo follow-up was known as Secret of Mana in all Western territories and elevated the series with its revamped power gauge and party system. Unfortunately, the third entry, Trials of Mana, did not make its way stateside during its initial 1995 release. As a result, fans would have to wait over 2 decades for an official English version in the form of Collection of Mana. That's everything that we have today from the 9 games that you didn't realize were Final Fantasy spin-offs. During 1987, it seemed that Square Enix really wanted to bump up their games and spread out the Final Fantasy series outside of Japan. They wanted to move into Western territories and allow the genre to be accepted. The original roleplay origins of Final Fantasy didn't really work in the West, so they had to create some titles to gain notoriety around the world. Many of the games we went over on today's list were the games that really brought JRPGs to the West or taught them about the Final Fantasy series. Some of these games are still well renowned today, especially games like the Mana series, as they were recently re-released on the Nintendo Switch in a collection bundle. Final Fantasy is still as big as ever and is continuously growing with new games every few years. We are even getting a brand new mainline series Final Fantasy game sometime next year, with it being set around dragons and fantasy once again. This is a departure from the last game, which was much more modern with cars and guns. The Final Fantasy series is definitely something you guys should check out, and if you haven't managed to play any of these games on today's list,